All right, I've got 1:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'd like to officially welcome you here to Gettysburg National Military Park and our second installment of the 2025 Midwinter Lecture Series. For those of you that have just walked in over the last couple minutes, if you are interested, you have a great time in this program, you're interested in this series, our full list of these talks every Saturday and Sunday for the next 2 months, you can find on our website or social media channels, as well as some brochures at our information desk. And for those of you that will be watching this at home on YouTube in the near future, after this is recorded, just know that the audience is packed today, and there's actually one more person here than was at my colleague and friend Matt Atkinson's talk yesterday on the first day of the program, first day of the series. So with that, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different today, not so much battle related, but the aftermath of the battle itself, and how are the numerous challenges faced by the citizens here at Gettysburg for the emergency units that are raised by the state of Pennsylvania sent here to help clean up the battlefield. Everything from getting men medical supplies and operations to what are we going to do with the dead? How are we going to deal with this huge man-made disaster that occurred over the first 3 days of July 1863. Now, before we take you back 162 years ago, I want to take you back to more recent history. Just a couple months ago, I'm sure many of you saw in the news and have seen some of the startling images of the destruction that was caused by Hurricane Helene. If you want to look at it by the numbers, the size, scale, and scope of this storm was impressive to say the least. A Category 4 storm, it caused catastrophic destruction over a 500-mile radius. It was a deadly storm. As of the researching and writing of this program, the current death toll stands at 230 deaths spread across the states of North and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, and Virginia. The rain and storm surge brought more than 30 inches of rain and a 15-foot storm surge. Over 20 tornadoes were reported in multiple states. 400 roads were closed in one state alone as a direct result to the damage suffered by this storm. Power loss. 4 million customers lost power throughout these states in the days and weeks after this storm passed. And projections right now in early 2025 reach the $225 to $250 billion level to completely repair and restore these areas of our country as a result of this storm. Now, as our sensationalist media traveled down there, you got the guy from the Weather Channel standing out in the middle of a Cat 4 storm telling you don't stand outside during the storm. You know, and they're shoving their cameras in the faces of these folks that have suffered this tragedy and have lost everything. Can you tell us what it was like? What the media doesn't report on, and the stories you don't hear, is who is left to pick up the pieces after the devastation on this massive scale. So I challenge you with several questions today. Who's ultimately responsible for the cleanup efforts along this 400-mile stretch of the United States? Is it local? Is it state? Is it federal? Anybody hear that answer in the media? I didn't. Who's responsible for searching, finding, and removing the dead, storing the remains, performing the identification processes for these remains, and notifying family members to those that died in these states? Local coroners? State agencies? Federal agencies? Certainly FEMA was deployed. American Red Cross was. Who's responsible for this work? Can anyone remember the name of a person or persons responsible for the cleanup effort of this event that just happened in the last several months? I would challenge all of you in this room today that many of us, most of us, perhaps all of us, could not. I want you to think about these questions of who's responsible for this work in the tail end of 2024 and perhaps the next several years, if not decades, in parts of North Carolina. And translate those questions of responsibility and care for the cleanup effort to not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster and July of 1863. And to get a better understanding of those challenges faced by the residents of Gettysburg, I want to first give you some idea to those that witnessed the aftermath of the battle firsthand. What did the battlefield and surrounding towns and surrounding countrysides of Gettysburg look like in the immediate wake of this 72-hour fight? The Gettysburg Compiler, a local paper, reported on July 20th, 1863. They shared a snippet of an account of a special correspondent from the Philadelphia newspaper, The Daily Age, a man by the name of Mr. Cook, who had traveled here immediately in the wake of the battle to get a look at what war was like firsthand and to report on it. When he arrived here in the immediate days after the battle, Cook wrote in part the following description of what he saw here on the fields around Gettysburg. He said, "The ground was tramped into a bog and was covered with every conceivable thing. Old broken muskets, bayonets, ramrods, pieces of wagons, broken wheels, cartridge boxes, belts, torn clothing, blankets, fragments of shells, and sometimes unexploded ones. Bullets, cartridges, powder, everything used in war by soldiers was scattered around in plenty. The grain and grass which once grew there was almost ground to a jelly. Everywhere could be seen traces of the carnage. Hundreds of dead horses, still unburied, lay on the field. And in boggy places and spots distant from the town, many of the men were still unburied." Exactly 3 weeks after Pickett's charge had come to a conclusion, local Gettysburg lawyer and citizen David Wills would write to the governor of the state, Andrew Curtin. On July 24th, he shared, even 3 weeks after the battle, the condition of the fields around this town with the state's governor. He wrote, quote, "Our dead are lying on the fields unburied, that is, no grave being dug, with small portions of the earth dug up alongside of the body and thrown over it. In many instances, arms and legs and sometimes heads protrude. And my attentions have been directed to several places where the hogs were actually rooting out the bodies and devouring them. And this on Pennsylvania soil, and in many cases the bodies of the patriotic soldiers of our state. Humanity calls on us to take measures to remedy this. And I think that it was in the contemplation of the state legislature of 1862 to remedy such matters by making provision for the honorable burial of our state who may fall on the field." Who is David Wills, this local Gettysburg citizen and lawyer? To reach just 2-3 dozen miles north of us to the state capital of Pennsylvania, to describe the conditions and urge the governor that these men, these noble patriotic men of this state who fell and gave what Lincoln would later call their last full measure of devotion in defense of Pennsylvania, that they have not received a final and fitting burial. David Wills was born on February 3rd, 1831, on a farm just north of the town of Gettysburg in Bendersville. He was the only son born into the family, and tragically his mother died when he was just 4 years of age. By the time David was 12 in 1843, Dad decided to take advantage of the great schools that were here in Gettysburg. And so he packed up the kids and moved a little bit closer to town to get them enrolled in public school in Gettysburg. At age 13, David enrolled in the Preparatory School of Pennsylvania. You know it today as Gettysburg College. And he graduated in 1851. I think David wanted to spread his wings like most young people do after they get out of high school and pick a college far away from mom and dad and home. And so he decided to pick perhaps the most farthest place you can imagine from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a small blip of a town known as Cahaba, Alabama. He travels there, he takes a job as principal of an academy, and he'll teach there for just 1 year. But for those of you that have had college-age children or are currently going through that yourself, you probably had at least 1 or 2 conversations about them getting a little homesick. And I like to think that David got a little homesick as well. After just 1 year in Cahaba, he returned back here to Gettysburg. He gave up on education, decided to switch careers, and wanted to study to become a lawyer. And he would reach out to perhaps one of the most well-known lawyers from the area, a man by the name of Thaddeus Stevens. Wills would start studying law with Stevens at his Lancaster office. And there, after some hard work in 1854, David Wills would take and pass the bar exam, and he would open his law office here in Gettysburg. Just 2 years later, he married the love of his life, Catherine Smizer, and they began a family in their large 3-story home in the town square, also known as the Diamond. Wills would have his first floor office for his law practice in the building. He would rent out some space on the first floor as well, and the family would live in the upper floors of the home. By 1863, the Wills family numbered 3 children, and Mom was currently expecting number 4 months pregnant at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Wills is an incredibly active member in the Gettysburg community. He is the Burgess of the borough several times during this period. He's president of the town council, serves as a councilman. He's an attorney for the borough. He's the first county superintendent of schools. He works as the secretary of the Hanover Junction, Hanover and Gettysburg Railroad. And he's also very active in local politics. Wills was a former Whig. But as the Whig Party folded up and many threw their support to this burgeoning Republican Party, Wills went all in and became a prominent member in the Republican Party here in South Central Pennsylvania and Gettysburg itself. So Wills is very well known by July of 1863 amongst those in the town of Gettysburg and the surrounding areas. So on July the 10th, 7 days after the Battle of Gettysburg is over, the governor of Pennsylvania decides to come to see the battlefield. Think of it as an early version of a USO tour. The governor of the state of Pennsylvania comes here. He wants to see where Pennsylvania soldiers fought on this battlefield. He wants to visit hospitals where Pennsylvania soldiers are currently receiving treatment for injuries and wounds sustained during the battle, cheer them up, ask how their morale is doing, and if anything they needed to make sure those needs are fulfilled. And Curtin also wants to visit some of the numerous cemeteries, impromptu cemeteries that are opening up at these field hospitals and these impromptu battlefield burials where dead Pennsylvanians have been laid. When Curtin and his entourage arrived at the train station on Carlisle Street north of town, still standing today, you can go and visit, he gets into the town of Gettysburg itself. It's just 1 block walk south into the town square. And Curtin's party begins asking around for someone that can show him these things, why he is here. And of course, the governor of Pennsylvania, a Republican at the time, is going to be recommended, a prominent Republican in the town, and that prominent Republican happens to be David Wills. And Wills will oblige the Curtin entourage that day and act as tour guide for them and take them around this area. One historian of the park, longtime historian by the name of Kathy Harrison here, noted that Curtin's only plans at the outset of his Gettysburg visit were to see that Pennsylvania soldiers were being taken care of properly in the battlefield hospitals and in the army. But that tour greatly expanded his vision for what he came here for in the first place. So they have this day-long tour. They end up back at the train station at the end of July 10th. Curtin, his entourage, they're getting ready to get on the train to head back to the Capitol up in Harrisburg. And it's at that time that Curtin and Wills have a conversation. Both of these men are horrified at what they have seen on the battlefield in regards to the treatment of dead Pennsylvania soldiers and the conditions of their burial locations on the field. They're seeing the arms and legs protruding from the ground. They're seeing the heads protruding. They're seeing where loved ones over the last several days have flocked to the area. They're digging open many of these hastily and shallowly constructed graves. They're looking for someone. They don't find them. They're leaving the remains exposed to the elements. They're not covering them back over. Rain has set in, high heat, humidity, animals, insects. It is not a pretty sight. And it's at that point that the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, is going to task Wills with an immense job. He's going to tell Wills that he's going to give him the full power and authorityship of the governorship of the state. Wills and Curtin are now equal with what they can do. And Wills is to use that power and authority to go across this battlefield and find every Pennsylvanian that has been killed during the battle and whose remains rest on these fields in the surrounding area. Not only is he tasked with finding those Pennsylvanians, he's going to be asked to identify them all in an era where dog tags are not common practice. Once he has located the remains, he's had them embalmed, he's had a coffin constructed for them, he's identified them, he is to find their families across the massive state of Pennsylvania, when the fastest source of communication is telegraph and letter writing. There's no yellow pages in 1863. Pennsylvania supplies 38,000 troops to this battle. Imagine how many John Smiths there were amongst the Pennsylvanians. How do you find the right John Smith's family? And once he's tracked down the family, he is to have those remains escorted with one Union soldier by train back to their hometown to be interred in the local cemetery. It is a daunting task, and Wills will readily accept the challenge from Curtin. Curtin gets on the train and heads back to the capital in Harrisburg. Meanwhile, 10 days later, a newspaper out of Harrisburg will report exactly these terms that Wills and Curtin have created for this work to be done. The Harrisburg Evening Telegraph reported in their evening edition on July the 20th, quote, "By a dispatch from Chambersburg, we learn that every arrangement has been made at Gettysburg by Governor Curtin for the removal, on application to David Wills residing there, of the bodies of Pennsylvanians killed in the late battle. A map of the battlefield has been made which shows the exact locality of every grave. A list of the wounded and sick Pennsylvanians is also being made, and every facility for finding the soldiers will be afforded. Transportation will be furnished at the state expense for the body, and one person to accompany it." Wills is about to get incredibly busy, because from that little newspaper blurb, it's picked up and put in this paper, and this paper, and this paper, across the state. And then it spreads outside of Pennsylvania. And now the telegraph line in Gettysburg and the arrival of mail to David Wills, "We haven't heard from my son. We think he's been killed. Can you find him? Do you know anything about him? Can you get his remains removed home?" begins immediately. This map that's prepared, this list of sick and injured Pennsylvanians that the paper declares is ready to roll, so all he has to do is look these things up. Those aren't done yet. The only way to find these names, to find these bodies, is to walk over the thousands of acres of this battlefield in search of these men. The work that Curtin charged Wills with completely overwhelmed him and quickly overwhelmed him. Immediately in the coming days, Wills starts reviewing, not only receiving, but also reviewing these applications for the removal of dead Pennsylvanians. He has got to get this map drawn up of the battlefield and have it marked with each grave. He has to generate a list of all the sick and wounded at a time when hospitals are consolidating and moving across the battlefield. So he's got to find these guys, get their information, and create this list. Wills is going to be corresponding a lot with a major up in Harrisburg about it. And this major in Harrisburg is constantly, he's working for Curtin in the capital. He's constantly wiring here to Wills, "Hey, you got that list yet? We could really use that list up in Harrisburg. When's the list going to be ready?" Wills finally writes back 11 days into the job. He says, "I have not got the list of wounded completed yet. It is an undertaking of much greater magnitude than we contemplated." Wills is beginning to arrange transportation for these bodies, trying to find a Union soldier to accompany it. He's answering letters and telegrams. He's requesting information on wounded and dead from regiments and units and other men. He is completely overwhelmed. Now, in addition to all this, Wills has to, like the other citizens of Gettysburg, pick up the pieces. Their lives were thrown up in the air during this battle. We can speculate that Wills and the family ride out the storm of battle in the basement of his home, but in the wake of this aftermath, where are they getting food? Things that were ready to be harvested and purchased for sale are gone. In addition to that, Wills' wife decides to turn in the rest of the home into a hospital for wounded Union officers. In particular, Captain Francis B. Jones of the 149th Pennsylvania, Captain William H. Rexford of the 24th Michigan, the Iron Brigade is brought there. Colonel Henry Morrow is also brought there. And there's even one very scant reference that famed Winfield Scott Hancock will reside in the home of the Wills for several days during his recovery before being transported out of Gettysburg proper. So he's got a family to look after. He's got all of the work of this massive project the governor has given him. His home is being turned into a field hospital, and he still needs his law practice to keep moving forward to generate income to take care of his family. You think our lives are busy today. Imagine how long his days were in the second half of July of 1863. Now, in addition to all that, Wills is also beginning to work with a number of other what we call state agents. Other governors from other northern states are sending men here to Gettysburg to do the same thing. Find the dead of their state, get them embalmed, get them identified, get them in coffins, and ship them out of Gettysburg proper. So as he's meeting all these other state agents, he's trying to help them as best he can. He's having conversations with them. And very on in these conversations, in the second half of July, there begins to be some conversations about creating a cemetery here in Gettysburg. Some of these agents, particularly the ones from Massachusetts, are going to propose the idea that Massachusetts is going to buy a small portion of the battlefield, collect their decomposing dead that litter the landscape, and bury them on the battlefield in a Massachusetts-only cemetery here at Gettysburg. So that's some discussion that Wills is hearing. Other discussion he is hearing comes from a man by the name of Andrew Cross, who is part of the Christian Commission of Pennsylvania, an aid society, a forerunner to the American Red Cross. And Wills and Cross are having some conversations about the idea that we could transform some portion of the battlefield into a cemetery in which we can bury the dead from the late battle. Cross is going to take the idea so far as to write an appeal to the Northern home front titled "To the Patriotic of the Land, a Cemetery for Those Who Fell at Gettysburg." And this is published in a Harrisburg newspaper on July 29, 1863. Still, there are others that are talking about the idea of creating a cemetery here at Gettysburg. Dr. Theodore Diamond, he was a surgeon for a New York regiment, 1861 and 1862. He just finished his term of service in 1863, goes back to his state of New York, and then he writes the governor of the state of New York, Horatio Seymour, and says, "Hey, listen, I'm bored. I have nothing to do. I have these skills. Where do you need me?" And Seymour says, "Well, we just had this big battle. I'm sure you heard about it down in Gettysburg. New York has got a lot of dead and wounded down there. They could use your help. Go down there and help my brother, John, who's assisting with the cleanup effort of the New York dead." So Diamond comes down here and pitches in. And Diamond is going to write in his journal, which isn't published till many, many, many years after the war, that it's during this time that he begins adding up the cost of buying a coffin, and the cost of embalming the remains, and the cost of rail transportation, and all of these things. And he's realizing with the number of New York soldiers that participate in this fight, which has the most number of soldiers here at the Battle of Gettysburg, it's going to bankrupt the state. There's no way they're going to be able to afford to send this many remains back to New York. So it's Diamond that starts coming up with the idea, well, maybe we should have a cemetery for the New York dead here at Gettysburg. What's pushing all of these conversations in these circles of these state agents and relief societies is the rapid deterioration of the bodies on the field and the potential health crisis that looms for those in Gettysburg and the surrounding communities. In addition to that, the loss of their identities is also on the table. Many of the Union remains for the Union Army, as they're pulling out, their comrades in arms found scraps of wood, cracker box lids, you name it, and used everything from lead pencil to charcoal to write the names of who was under this mound of earth. But as rainstorms came in to Gettysburg after the battle, as the elements started to be exposed to these temporary headboards, by the end of the month of July, a lot of them are becoming illegible. One of the earliest historians of the battle, a man by the name of John Batchelder, who'd arrived here just within days after the Battle of Gettysburg to document it. Batchelder wrote to the governor of Pennsylvania, Curtin, in the beginning days of August. He said, "I'm obliged to carefully canvass every rod of the ground to get all the names. I find that a large proportion of them were written with lead pencil, and by the rains beating the fresh earth upon them have already become nearly effaced. And before the coming autumn, many will be entirely obliterated. I cannot bear to leave a name unmarked which another rain may blot out from its friends forever." So by the end of the month of July, there is a big push to change the way the cleanup efforts are being handled here with respect to the dead in Gettysburg. For Wills and his work for the Pennsylvania dead, he's going to continue to report to Governor Curtin on that process. But Wills basically lays out for Curtin the options that they have to deal with this growing threat and the loss of these soldiers' identity by the end of the month of July. And this is what he lays out on the table. Here's the first decision. They can ignore the situation entirely, and they can let the families and friends bear all the burdens. Let them travel to Gettysburg, look for the remains, pay for the embalming, the coffin, the transportation, the whole 9 yards. Another option on the table by the end of July: remove the Union dead to a common burial ground purchased by one or all of the Union states. Option 3, let the families and friends remove those whom they could not transport a long distance and reinterm the remains in a civilian cemetery. Option 4, accurately record the graves and delay any decision on the whole problem and challenge. So by the end of July, Wills decides at this point, we need to get everybody talking together, not just conversations I'm having in these different circles. So on July 23rd or 24th, we're not really sure on the exact date. There's some speculation on which night it was. Wills calls a meeting, and he invites all the state agents from the Union states here working on the situation with their state's respective dead at his office in his home in the center of Gettysburg. And it's out of this meeting that an idea is born to create a national cemetery here at Gettysburg for all of the Union dead that gave their last full measure of devotion. Now, there's a lot of historical arguments as to whose idea, who gets the credit for creating or originating the idea for the national cemetery here at Gettysburg. And it comes down to two really key figures in this story, one of which we're focusing on today, David Wills. After the meeting, Wills is going to write to Curtin. He's going to talk about the meeting that he's had, and he tells Curtin that he has suggested to buy a piece of the battlefield and make it a common burial ground for the dead, now only partially buried over miles of the country around Gettysburg. At the same point in time, Dr. Diamond, we heard about, this guy from New York who's come and looking at all these costs and expenditures and perhaps having a cemetery for the New York dead. Diamond writes up to New York and also records in his journal on August 1st, he said, quote, "At my request, therefore, a meeting was held at the office of David Wills, agent of the state of Pennsylvania. And at this meeting, I, Diamond, presented a proposition that a portion of the ground occupied by our line of battle on Cemetery Hill should be purchased for a permanent burial place for the soldiers of our army who lost their lives in this battle or who died here of their wounds, and that their bodies should be gathered from the fields in which they were interred and deposited in this burial place by regiments and states with proper marks designated in their graves." So both of these men have valid claims as to who originates this idea for a national cemetery here at Gettysburg. Historians ever since have battled back and forth. It was David Wills. It was Theodore Diamond. Well, the National Park Service here at Gettysburg owns and operates David Wills' home. So who do you think we're going to pick? Reading between all the lines and going through all the layers of work, most certainly there were many discussion amongst many individuals of some sort of cemetery here at Gettysburg for the Union dead. However, regardless of who you assign the credit to, it's Wills that's going to live here and remain here in Gettysburg and work on this project for the next 6 years. Diamond goes back to New York. The relief societies go to other battlefields as the war continues on. Wills is going to be left with ensuring that these men have received a final and fitting resting place. So with that, an idea is born, a committee is composed and created for the work on this cemetery project, and Wills is voted by the committee to head up the cemetery project. Now, in addition to everything he's been doing for the whole month of July so far, that the governor of Pennsylvania has given him, now he's got to take over this project of a national cemetery incorporating the state's deads of all the Union states that fought here at Gettysburg. His immediate duties include making all financial arrangements. That's from everything from buying coffins, buying ground, hiring workers, contracting, quarrying stone, hiring stonemasons to chisel names into granite. Anything related to money and expenditures, Wills needs to get it done. He needs to determine the reburial methods. How are we getting these men off the battlefield? How are we reburying them in the ground that we're going to put them in? He needs to create a permanent committee for the perpetual care of the cemetery. He needs to do it immediately. That's great, we have this idea, but who's going to take care of it? Are we going to have workers from Minnesota maintain the cemetery? Are they going to maintain just their graves in this cemetery? How are we going to, in perpetuity, take care of this cemetery? He needs to hire a surveyor and an architectural landscape designer. What's the cemetery going to look like? When I buy this property, I need to make sure I have the deeds to the property to make sure that the land survey is correct. So I need to get that done immediately. But most importantly, the most pressing thing for Wills to do now that he's in charge of this cemetery project is he needs to buy land. And the committee was all in agreement that the land that should be purchased should be land that was important to the Union Army's battle position, battle line during the Battle of Gettysburg, and was central or played a role in their ultimate victory at the end of the fighting or the conclusion of the battle. So one of the first challenges that Wills has then is securing that suitable land. And this is going to be one of the most difficult challenges for the entire cemetery project that Wills is responsible for navigating. Now, some of the earliest properties, and you're looking at a map here from an old study on the National Cemetery. If you see those red boxes towards the center of the image there, the road just below it, between the red boxes and the word cemetery, that's the Baltimore Pike. You are looking at those properties on what we would call East Cemetery Hill today, where the equestrian statue to Oliver Otis Howard sits and artillery batteries from the 11th and 1st Corps. That is the first proposed ground. Very quickly on, the veterans of this battle, the eyewitnesses of the battle, those that are here like Batchelder immediately studying the battle, the most important place on the battlefield at Gettysburg for the Union Army is not Little Round Top, folks. It's not Cemetery Ridge. The most important place on the Gettysburg battlefield, recognized in the immediate aftermath of this battle, is Cemetery in Culp's Hill. You're not burying or creating a cemetery on Culp's Hill. Cemetery Hill is the suitable option. It's the center of the Union battle line. It's important to their victory, and it has a great view. So the initial proposed ground that Wills has to purchase are from two property owners with the last names Menchie and Raffensperger. And so he wants these two lots to combine to place the cemetery there. Those two lots combined equal about 8 acres in ground. Wills will follow up to Curtin on July 24th after the meeting, not only the results of that meeting and this proposed idea, but that this is the ground that we should purchase for this project. Wills describes it incredibly accurately. And let me give you what he saw on that property on July 24th. He said, "It is an elevated piece of ground on the Baltimore Turnpike. It is opposite the cemetery, the town's private cemetery." We get that question all the time. The town's private cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, opened in 1854. You build a cemetery on a hill, guess what they're going to name the hill? Cemetery Hill. It's not named as such after the National Cemetery. So near the cemetery. He said it is a place where our army had about 40 pieces of artillery in the action, and for their protection had thrown up a large number of earthworks. It is the point on which the desperate attack was made by the Louisiana brigades on Thursday evening when they succeeded in reaching the guns. It was the key to the whole line of our defenses, the apex of the triangular line of battle. Notice he didn't say fishhook. The triangular line of battle. And it is the spot above all others for the honorable burial of the dead who have fallen on these fields. So Wills writes to Curtin on July 24th, this is the ground the committee approves me to get. I approve of this ground as well. I need your stamp of approval before I spend the state of Pennsylvania's money on purchasing 8 acres of ground. July 24th passes. No response from Curtin. July 25th, nothing. July 26th, nothing. 27th, nothing. 28th. Finally, on the evening of the 28th, Wills is left holding the bag here. He's heard nothing from Curtin, and he wires up to Harrisburg. He says, please advise me immediately by telegraph in reference to the contents of my letter of Saturday. Shall I buy the land? There is an offer for it. I fear I cannot hold the owners longer without a promise to purchase. Where's the governor of Pennsylvania? He is in the re-election fight of his life. He's campaigning. When he left on July 10th and got on that train back to Harrisburg and gave all that power to Wills, he did that for a reason. He's not going to be around. He's not going to be available. He's trying to win re-election. And so Wills is getting frustrated. I need you to approve this thing. Where are you? There's offers on this land. If I lose this ground that's been approved by everybody, all the other state agents have all said this is the best spot. This is what we want for this cemetery. If I lose this ground, where are we going to put this cemetery? So the problem comes from that other offer that these two property owners have. And that other offer is being made by another barrister in the town of Gettysburg. Some things just haven't changed in 162 years. Got a lot of lawyers and taverns in this town, and both of them keep each other busy. So shortly after Wills' letter arrives up to Curtin on the evening of July 24th, and Wills is waiting and waiting and waiting for a response, another local attorney by the name of David McConaughey sends a letter up to Curtin as well. Now, McConaughey is president of the Evergreen Cemetery Association. And during the second half of July, as a local resident, McConaughey is also having an idea of having a cemetery for the Union dead. But being the president of the Evergreen Cemetery, where do you think he wants them to be buried? He wants them buried in Evergreen. And he's going to do something real great for the American public who have lost their loved ones in this battle. He is going to rebury them in the Evergreen Cemetery, and he's going to put a gated fence around the Union dead from the battle, and he is going to charge you admission to go in and pay your respects. And the money raised from that admission is going to go into the Evergreen Cemetery Association's treasury. And McConaughey has been active over the second half of July. You can see where it says Evergreen Cemetery towards the center of the map. That's what the Evergreen Cemetery already owns. All those other green boxes is what McConaughey has purchased from the end of the battle to the beginning of August. He's purchased most of Cemetery Hill. So Wills is, in a real tight spot because some of the ground that he told, remember we wrote the governor saying, hey, these guys got offers, Menchie and Raffensperger got offers. It's from McConaughey. Not only do they have offers, they got money already. So Wills has an immediate problem. And what begins to develop is basically a feud via telegraph between Wills and McConaughey, both writing to the governor of Pennsylvania. You have Wills and the Cemetery Commission idea for this national cemetery to be put on Cemetery Hill. You have McConaughey vying for the remains to be put in the Evergreen Cemetery that they will charge people to come and visit. So this goes back and forth, and it spills out in the town. McConaughey's also a pretty prominent member in Gettysburg, and this fight spills out. And finally, the citizens of Gettysburg get involved into this whole thing. And they write a letter and signed this group letter to the governor of Pennsylvania and said, look, these two guys are fighting about this ground back and forth. Other areas of the battlefield are now being contemplated for the cemetery, and they are not as good as the original position that was selected by the Cemetery Commission. You need to break up this fight. You need to decide on something one way or the other. And it's that letter and McConaughey relenting slightly that is going to allow Wills to win the day. And he's going to be able to buy what will eventually turn into 17 acres on Cemetery Hill, and it will be those tracks pictured in the center of your screen here, where the National Cemetery rests today. And now the cemetery work can continue, and Wills is going to be incredibly busy following the settling of this disagreement, which doesn't really reach its zenith and pass till mid-August. So think about David Wills. By mid-August, a month after the battle, his home's almost at an end of being a hospital. He's maintaining his law practice for income. He's taking care of his family. His wife's now 5 months pregnant. He's got 3 little kids at home. He's heading up the National Cemetery Project Committee. He's still working as the state agent for Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Dead. And he's pursuing all of these other things. And while he's doing all that, he's already working towards the next phase of this process, the planning, preparation, and design of the National Cemetery itself. Now, between August 12th and 14th, Wills would prepare and send correspondence to 17 loyal governors concerning the cemetery project. Imagine writing 17 identical letters that are multiple pages. And we have some really great photocopies of some of those original letters that were sent to the governors at the time. And let me tell you what, there are a lot of pages, because he outlines a huge amount of things that this cemetery project is not only going to achieve upon completion, but guarantees that these governors will have. Because by mid-August, not all the Union states that had troops fighting here had signed on to the project. They weren't all 100% in and on board. And I'm ashamed to say my native state of Ohio is one of them. We've not reached out to David Wills yet about our dead here on this battlefield. And that'll be a story I'll finish off in just a moment. So he's writing all of these letters to all the governors of the individual Union states, not only telling them what the process is going to be, what the final project will look like, how they are going to pay, the total price of this thing. He's going to inform them of everything. At the same time, he's got to find someone to design the ground. What's the cemetery going to look like? You know, Wills is a really smart guy, but he ain't great at everything. And designing a cemetery is not on his list of accomplishments. So he needs to find somebody. He's going to find a man, pictured there on the left of the screen, a man by the name of William Saunders. Now, Saunders is a native of Scotland. He immigrates to the United States in 1848 at the age of 26. Originally settles in Connecticut. He'll move on to Philadelphia in 1862. And by 1863, he is working at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. He was their landscape gardener and superintendent of the grounds there at the Department of Agriculture. A man by the name of Myron Brent in the Brooklyn Daily Times years later was writing the story of the creation of the cemetery. And he asked the question, how did David Wills in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania get the name of the gardener at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.? And what Brent would write in his narrative, he said, Mr. Saunders had evidently made some reputation in the country along his line of work at Philadelphia and Baltimore, which is probably responsible for the fact that he was sought out to design, plan, and lay out the beautiful cemetery. Saunders will write in his journal about this whole process, which sadly is unpublished, but you can research it and have it pulled at the Department of Agriculture today. I did not know this. The Department of Agriculture has their own archives. I don't know what they're storing in there, maybe some old corn or something, but apparently amongst the old corn is William Saunders' journal. He was a daily writer in his journal and diary every single day in his life. He recorded daily events and the like, and he records in detail the time after he received the letter from Wills inviting him to come up to Gettysburg and look around and perhaps sign on to this project. So very interesting. So Saunders comes on board. He's going to design the cemetery layout. When he gets up here, Wills had only purchased 12 acres of ground up there. Saunders looks around, he's discussing ideas with Wills, and poor David Wills, I mean, at this point, this guy's got to be just burned out. And he's had this huge property dispute with McConaughey and the citizens of Gettysburg over the last month that he's just finally gotten past that point. And Saunders tells him, unless you get more land, I'm not working on this project. I can't design a cemetery that'll look beautiful in 12 acres. I need more ground. So now Wills is forced to go back to some of those property owners that were originally going to sell to David McConaughey in the Evergreen Cemetery, and now they took a much lower price because the state of Pennsylvania got involved. Government red tape. We've got to buy things at cost. Now I got to go back to them and ask for more land. And in all, Wills will end up with those additional 5 acres, total of 17 acres. Saunders signs on and they get to work. Now, one of the truly interesting points at this moment in Wills's work is not the landscape itself, not what trees and shrubs are going to be in there, not necessarily, how the headstones are going to be arranged, but how the bodies are going to be arranged. And the next fight that David Wills is going to have to wrangle through amongst all the loyal northern states is exactly how the bodies are going to be placed in the cemetery. And what's so interesting, so striking, that for 2 years of this war by 1863, the main war effort was to restore the Union, to prevail against the notion of what? States' rights. Well, now, the loyal governors of the Union states want states' rights in the National Cemetery. Wills and the committee have envisioned a true national cemetery. We're going to remove the remains from the battlefield, and as they come to the cemetery, we're going to bury them. Not by company, not by regiment, not by last name, not alphabetical, not by state. That their sacrifice is equal across the board, not even by rank. Everybody that gave their life in this battle, their sacrifice is equal. They will be buried indiscriminately in the battlefield to emphasize that equality. Well, the governors of these states and their agents go up and do an uproar. My men from Massachusetts will be buried in their own section to be separated from Minnesota and Ohio and all the rest of them. And Massachusetts is going to have this, and Minnesota wants that, and we want our men in a separate section. And my Indianans will not be buried next to New Yorkers. Wills is pushing this idea of a truly national cemetery. But the governors want own state plots. So they reach sort of a compromise. And the compromise is this. There will be state plots within the National Cemetery. But within each state plot, those men are not buried by any sort of order. Not by rank, not by last name, not by unit number. They are buried indiscriminately within their own state. So Wills has passed another challenge during this time. By late August of 1863, things have turned real bad on the battlefield. It's hot, it's humid, we've had lots of rainstorms, the decomposition of the dead have reached a health crisis here in town. And the colonel of the 36th Pennsylvania Militia, who's sent here after the Battle of Gettysburg, they're kind of going to support the Provost Guard in their efforts to clean up the field and police all the government property and bury the dead. Colonel Henry C. Allen of the 36th Pennsylvania is going to issue a decree, and he's going to say that during the months of August and September, all work regarding bodies comes to an end. No corpse will be allowed to be disinterred from any of the burial grounds, cemeteries, or battleground of Gettysburg, his orders dictate. The health of the wounded soldiers and citizens of this community requires the stringent enforcement of this order, and any violation of it reported to these headquarters will meet with summary and severe punishment. Now, the citizens of Gettysburg, who've just gone through this traumatic ordeal, have not always been happy about welcoming all of you tourists to town. And one of the things that's been happening for the last 6 weeks as visitors are flocking to this battlefield and they're plucking things off the ground is they're disturbing these remains that are already in poorly shallow graves, poorly dug and constructed graves, and they're pulling these things open and exposing them. And when these remains get exposed, you have insects and mosquitoes that feast on those decomposing remains. And what do? They come to you, healthy citizen in town, and bite you. and now you have typhus, and now you have typhoid fever, and now these diseases are beginning to spread, and rodents are beginning to appear. It is a nightmarish scene. We need to stop people from touching and messing with these dead bodies on the ground. And so the citizens, 2 weeks later, are going to post a thank you letter in one of the local town papers to Colonel Henry Alleman. And this is what the citizens of Gettysburg tell him. And I think it's a good insight in what it was like to be a citizen here during this cleanup process. This is what they wrote. Quote, "The extensive and careless disinterment of the dead from our battlefields had become a great nuisance, and very grave fears were entertained universally for the health of our people, and by many strong apprehensions of pestilence. The intense heat which prevailed ever since the issuance of your orders must, if the practice of disinterment prohibited had continued, have produced widespread sickness and distress. Our atmosphere was that of a carnal house. To your sagacity and vigorous action, we attribute our escape from the dread result." The citizens of Gettysburg are relieved that they are going to protect the remains that are on the battlefield yet and that have not been removed, and allow cooler weather to come, and with cooler weather, the removal of insects and rodents that can spread disease from feasting on these remains. Now, meanwhile, as Wills is doing all of this and all these things are going on, he has another idea. And if you don't want to credit him for the idea of a national cemetery here at Gettysburg, this next idea is solely his. He writes to Governor Curtin on August the 17th, and he says, "Governor, I got a great idea. The idea is this: let's have a ceremony to mark the official opening of the cemetery here at Gettysburg." And Curtin going to take 2 weeks to write back to David Wills. But in his return note, Curtin says, "I love the idea. It's a great opportunity for us to properly consecrate the ground. However, this idea of a national cemetery with all the Union dead from this battle on the battlefield being constructed during a war that's still raging, this is a brand new idea. Everybody in this country, North and South, and internationally, is going to be looking on a ceremony if we do one. So all that stuff you've been doing for the last month and a half, 2 months, you need to delegate it. If we're going to have a ceremony, it has to be done correctly. You cannot screw this up. The eyes of the world will be upon us." And Wills is going to do just that. So a ceremony has been decided upon, but who was to be the speaker? Who are the musical ensembles going to be? Who are the poet laureates? Who's going to do this, that, and the other? The list continues. Wills is going to have this onus to secure the dignitaries and organize the ceremony itself. He's going to search for a main speaker. It's not Abraham Lincoln. It's going to be perhaps one of the best public speakers in our country's history in the 19th century. Someone whose recognition, unless you're from New England and had it in middle school or high school, is completely forgot about today. His name is Edward Everett, perhaps one of the best orators of the 19th century. Read his speech on the Battle of Bunker Hill. It will knock your socks off. So Wills does this. He goes back and forth with Edward Everett. He says, "I want you. You're the best speaker. Everybody on my committee for this project wants you." Edward Everett is honored. Writes back, that's wonderful. I'm in. "When do you need me?" Wills writes back, "Well, we're going to look at a date. How's October 23rd? Everett writes back, "Ooh, yeah, that's a problem. It's not enough time for me to research the battle, to visit the battlefield, write about the importance of this battle, let alone place a deeper meaning onto the outcome of what happened months earlier." Wills writes back, "All right, well, what is the absolute earliest that you could possibly give this speech? Like the very first day you would be comfortable doing it?" Edward Everett writes back, "November 19th. Guess what date the ceremony's set for? November 19th. So Wills is working with this. Wills is writing to poets. He wants original poetry to be read at the ceremony. He's going to write to huge, well-known 19th century American poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and William Cullen Bryant. Both of them turn him down. He's going to reach out to musical ensembles. Writes to the United States Marine Corps Band. "We want you as the main musical act during the ceremony." He's going to work with local community choirs and ensembles to perform as well. He's going to select a marshal for the procession preceding the ceremony. He's going to work with the what would later become unofficially Lincoln's bodyguard, a man by the name of Ward Hill Lamont, who's the U.S. Marshal in the District of Columbia. So now he's going to work with this guy to deal with all the details of the procession just to get to the ceremony at the National Cemetery on November 19th. Wills is also getting involved for transportation of visitors and tourists to this event. He realizes that this thing has the potential to be big. There's only one train line, repair train tracks, that gets into Gettysburg. And that drops off on Carlisle Street at the Gettysburg train station. He is going to write to the CEOs and executives of all these private rail lines across the North and say, hey, we're having this ceremony. There's going to be a lot of people. Can you add extra passenger cars to your trains to this area? Wills is going to be involved in absolutely all the minutia. And he's going to work on this throughout August, September, October, and into November. Now, at the same time he's working on this, let's just give him something else to do, right? The orders of messing with the dead on the battlefield are lifted in the month of October, and now Wills can work towards actually getting the dead bodies off the battlefield and reburied into the cemetery itself. On October 15th, 1863, Wills is going to put what we would call today a request for proposal, an RFP in the local newspapers, asking for contractors to bid on two different contracts. Contract 1, removing the dead from the battlefield, putting them on coffins, and having the coffins transported to the cemetery itself. Contract 2, digging the ground or the new graves in the cemetery, lowering the coffins in, and completing the landscape in the cemetery itself. All the bids are returned by October 22nd, just 7 days later. In all, Wills received 34 bids that he had to go through and process, and he eventually would award the contract to the lowest bidder, a man by the name of Frederick W. Besecker. Now, this is where the story of the cemetery work and Wills kind of gets a little gray. Besecker may or may not hire some of the other people involved in the cemetery project. It may be Wills that hires them. We're just not sure. There's not enough primary evidence for us, primary sources, to really get into it. But what we do know is that Besecker included will have other men such as Samuel Weaver, Basil Biggs, David and Leander Warren, and John B. Hoke working on this process beginning at the end of October. Wills is going to tell this crew they need to start the removal on October the 26th. We do know, however, Wills is going to hire one of William Saunders, that landscape architect guy, one of his good friends, a man by the name of James Townsend, to come up to Cemetery Hill and lay out. He's going to do all the property surveying, and he's going to lay out each individual grave on the hill itself and oversee the layout process. But Wills's role in that just doesn't end after he gets that ball rolling. At the end of every night and the end of every workday, two people are going to come to David Wills's office at his home in downtown Gettysburg. One of them is going to be Samuel Weaver. Weaver is going to be the manager in charge of the identification as the remains come out of the ground. No body can be pulled out of the ground unless Weaver is present. When the ground is opened up, Weaver's going to look through any personal belongings. He's going to rifle through uniforms, looking for any clues, grab a headboard if it's still standing there that can help him identify the remains. If there's a headboard still standing, that headboard is nailed onto the coffin. A number is given on that coffin, and Weaver is going to write down in his workbook that number, everything that was in the hole in the ground with those remains, and the possible identification. At the end of each day, that logbook, Weaver is going to walk into Will's office, and Wills is going to review each entry personally. At the same point in time, at the end of each day, that James Townsend, the guy that's supervising each hole being dug on Cemetery Hill, he's got a workbook. He's going to mark the number from the coffin that's come in. He's going to match it to any headboard that was attached to the coffin that was found on the battlefield, and he's going to write the position that it is given in the cemetery. And each position, those headstones, those granite markers that are there today, don't go in immediately. They use wooden boards with numbers engraved on them. And so Townsend's going to give them a number, and those numbers are going to match the numbers that Weaver made, and both of those books are now delivered to Wills at the end of every day for him to review and make sure they are correct before work starts the next morning. So think about everything that Wills is doing. By the end of October, now we got the bodies and the removal process starting. There's starting to be ceremonies here in Gettysburg. Wills is going to attend a flag raising on Little Round Top at the end of October of 1863. He's going to call a conference at the end of October at his home of some of the new state agents from other states that have now signed on to the project that are coming on board. He's going to tell them a little bit about the project, where it stands, all those things that he's been writing those governors to about. On October 28th, those 4 agents that have just arrived to town are going to go with Wills, and one of those agents is from the state of Ohio. Ohio's coming to check things out. We want to make sure, us Buckeyes, although we have the greatest college football team of all time, we want to make sure that this is going to be the greatest national cemetery of all time, and that Ohio's dead are going to be treated properly. So one of the new agents that comes to town at the end of October is from the state, sent there by the governor of Ohio at the time, a man by the name of David Todd, from my hometown of Youngstown, Ohio. So on the 28th, Wills is going to invite those 4 state agents, those newly arrived guys, to go out and to watch the burial of the first set of remains into the National Cemetery. They're going to walk to the battlefield before they go to this ceremony. They're going to watch B. Secker and his crew remove some remains so these agents can see how they remove the remains, how they're being treated and placed in the coffins, all of that stuff. They're going to, these new state agents want to see where General Reynolds was killed, so Wills is going to walk them all the way out to McPherson's Ridge and show them that. And by the time they finish up there, they go next to the National Cemetery, or the grounds of the newly created National Cemetery. And there, Wills with those Ohio agents are going to witness the burial of the first of Ohio's braves, as they are reported, a man by the name of Enoch M. Detty. Enoch M. Detty was not wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg. He will die from illness and disease in one of the hospitals after the battle itself. The military funeral that is conducted on Cemetery Hill so impresses those Ohio agents that they immediately write back to Governor Todd and tell him, look, this is the real deal. These are altruistic men here that are ensuring that these veterans of this battle, that their remains are going to be in a fitting and proper resting place, and we should sign on board to this project. And Ohio is all in. And one of the great redeeming things about that story is once Ohio goes all in, man, they are all in. They bring the most number of former governors and newly elected governors to the 19th ceremony. They hold their own political rally at the Presbyterian Church in town on the 19th, and they bring a whole host of people with them to the dedication ceremony. So Wills is working with that as well. Ward Hill Lamont, we heard about, he's been selected as the marshal for the procession here in town. He comes in November several times to meet with Wills. They're working together, so it is just a never-ending litany of things to do. And by the early parts of November, on November 2nd, David Wills is going to sit down to write a short note to Abraham Lincoln. And the note is going to define, not only extend an invitation to Lincoln to come to this ceremony, but also to define what Lincoln's role would be. And in that note, Wills is going to write the following. He's inviting the chief executive of the nation to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln is not the main speaker for the ceremony. Edward Everett's already been booked. And remember what Governor Curtin told Wills about the ceremony. It has to be perfect, right? If I book the President of the United States and he says, yes, I'm coming, and doesn't show, that's a problem. If I book him as the main speaker and he doesn't show, that's a problem. Or if he gets delayed or something else happens in the war effort, he can't get here. But if he's just going to say a few words, and at the last minute his presidential duties get in the way, no harm, no foul, there will not be any marring of the ceremony. Wills puts in a separate note with that formal invitation. Personal letter that he writes to Lincoln, and he tells Lincoln the following. He says, as the hotels in our town will be crowded and in confusion at the time referred to in the enclosed invitation, I write to you to stop with me. I hope you will feel it your duty to lay aside pressing business for a day to come on here to perform this last sad rite to our brave soldier dead on the 19th instant. Governor Curtin and Honor Edward Everett will be my guests at the time, and if you can come, you will please join them at my house. You will confer a favor if you advise me early of your intentions. Now think about everything Wills has been doing since July. All the stuff that has been on his plate. His wife by November is now 8 months pregnant. And Wills, I bet he was sleeping on the couch for a long time after November 19th because he invited 34 dignitaries to stay with him in his home. And he promised each of those dignitaries that his wife would provide wonderful meals, multiple course meals for them to enjoy during their stay. I'm sure at 8 months pregnant with 3 kids under 7, she was more than happy to give up her own bed and her own home to 34 guests and cook for all of them. Now, one of the things that is often told in this part of the story is that Lincoln was an afterthought. He was kind of forgotten about. Nobody thinks he's going to come. And Wills, just belatedly writes to him, and they don't think he's going to come anyway, so nothing will come of it. That it could be not further from the truth. We know that in late August of 1863, Governor Curtin goes to Washington, D.C. to meet with Lincoln. Pennsylvania is an important state, and it's an important state that Lincoln needs to remain under the control of a Republican governor in the coming elections. And so Curtin's a big mover and shaker in the Republican Party in this big state and the many votes that they have in Congress in the House of Representatives. So Curtin goes to meet with Lincoln. And we can't say for certain because that conversation was never recorded. But one of my fellow colleagues here at the park, Carlton Smith, believes that it's highly likely that at that point in time, on August 28th, Curtin in D.C. invites Lincoln to come to Gettysburg. The ceremony had already been decided upon, the date had already been decided upon, and that the invitation that Wills sends to Lincoln is just kind of the formal one. He'd already been verbally invited by Curtin months earlier. So, with that, it is now November 19th. The ceremony is to begin. Wills is going to march with the state agents and the commissioners that morning and in the procession. Before he even gets to that point, he plays tour guide once again. He's going to take several dignitaries that have stayed with him on a tour of the battlefield. There's some speculation as to whether or not he takes Lincoln or where they go, but we do know that Wills is going to go over the battlefield with some others that morning. They come back, they get ready for the procession, they line up, and Wills is going to march with them in the procession. To get from the David Wills' home in downtown Gettysburg to where the platform was constructed in basically Evergreen Cemetery, took them an hour to get down Baltimore Street. The procession numbered anywhere from 12 to 15,000 visitors. In addition to that, I think one of the very interesting things about the platform, and there's a picture of the day of the ceremony, all those dignitaries that I mentioned, and there's going to be even more of them that are going to cram onto that platform, are going to cram onto a platform that's only 12 by 20 feet in size. One of the things that the park is working towards is in the near future here for one of our dedication day ceremonies is a complete reconstruction of the day's events. All the original speeches, all the original music with the original size platform. So keep your eyes on that for the coming years. We're working on that, and you can see perhaps myself portraying my hometown hero, David Todd, from Youngstown, Ohio. After the ceremony's over, everybody starts to go home. There's a lot of media coverage of the event, just like Curtin predicted, and almost universally, they all praise David Wills. The Adams County Sentinel would write 4 days later that the ceremony was a perfect success. It was systematic arrangements, the beautiful order which prevailed throughout the ceremonies, on and on and on. The local Democratic paper in Gettysburg, the Compiler, also praised David Wills for his work. Lincoln's remarks, it's a 50-50 on who liked it and who didn't, not only for papers in the United States, but also over in England as well. But when this stuff ends on the 19th and people go home on the 20th and over the next couple days, Wills isn't done with his job. He's the head of this cemetery project now. The cemetery is not completed. Just 1 day later, and this is a really rare image. It's a pretty cool image too. That's what the National Cemetery looks like in November of 1863. You can see those wooden markers where they're putting the numbers on all of the work. You can see what we speculate is Frederick B. Secker, the winner of the contract, and James Townsend. They're laying those caskets. And one of the really cool things about this, and I'll just come over here for a minute, you can see this board here on the side of this coffin. When the crew working out on the battlefield came upon a body that had a temporary headboard, they nailed the temporary headboard to the coffin. And so many of the newly built coffins for the Union dead are going to be placed in the ground with the original headboards, which is a really neat thing to think about, that they're still with them today, all these years later. But on November 20th, the work in the cemetery continues. The reburial process resumes. Early in December of 63, Wills is going to write a final round of letters to all those governors. He proposes a meeting date of December 17th at the Jones House in Harrisburg to kind of get all the state agents and all the governors up to speed where the project stands. He's going to also at that time talk about some of the uncomfortable things. How much do each one of your states owe the state of Pennsylvania to pay for this project? In all, he's going to get 12 commissioners representing 10 states at that meeting in December of 1863. By April of 1864, arrangements had been made to begin work on enclosing the ground. That was one of the conditions of the ground being sold to Wills in the cemetery project from the Evergreen Cemetery, so they need to enclose it. He's detailing that work in April of 1864. By March of 1865, the enclosure around the grounds is completed, built of a well-built stone wall, heavy dressed capping stones. He goes on to report very eloquent details about the construction of it. And also by March of 1865, the ground had been graded, been prepared for the planting of trees in the coming spring. And he's talking about a contract had been entered into for putting up the headstones, and the work has been commenced. So those temporary headboards are going to be up there for nearly 2 years before they finally get the granite in the ground and start chiseling names into those headstones. So Wills is working on all of that yet in 1864 and in 1865. And by the summer of 1865, Wills has to plan another ceremony for the National Cemetery. And he's going to repeat the whole process, writing letters, inviting dignitaries, having people stay at his house. And this is for part of the original cemetery design, the laying of the cornerstone of what will become known as the Soldiers' National Monument. On July 4th, 1865, Wills, along with many other dignitaries that are in attendance that day, will witness the laying of the cornerstone of that monument. And it's at that point that Wills' work as the state agent of Pennsylvania will come to an end. He had been the state agent for Pennsylvania for nearly 2 full years. But his work isn't over yet, because now his role as the president of the Cemetery Association is going to start for the next 4 years. And on the dedication of the Soldiers' National Monument in July of 1869, it will be Wills' final act of his work to ensure those that had given their last full measure of devotion would have a final and fitting resting place here at Gettysburg for future generations in order to pay their respects to them. A Lincoln Gettysburg cemetery historian, a man by the name of Frank Clement, wrote this of Wills. He said, "David Wills lived to see his dream come true. His wish to transform a portion of the battlefield consecrated by the blood of brave men into a national cemetery reached fruition. The cemetery is much as a memorial to David Wills of Gettysburg as it is a burial ground for those whom Lincoln called these honored dead." A man by the name of Franklin Menzies in 1929, he was a House of Representative for the state of Pennsylvania, serving in Washington, D.C. at the time. And on the weekend that we refer to as President's Day, that Friday before, as Congress is in session, Menzies puts forth a bill, a resolution, to have 2 monuments constructed in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. One to Samuel William Saunders, who designed the National Cemetery, and one to David Wills. And he goes on to give a lengthy speech on the House floor about these 2 men and how their roles, if they had not been carried out to the degree in which they had, there would be no National Cemetery at Gettysburg today. This is what he said in part. Menzies wrote, "Had it not been for 2 men, possibly one, the immortal Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln, which, with the famous speech of Pericles, ranks among the most eloquent contributions to English literature, might never have been written or delivered. 2 men are mainly responsible for it. One is David Wills, a lawyer and judge of Gettysburg. Judge Wills conceived the idea of a national cemetery on the famous battlefield and communicated it to Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, who was favorably impressed with it and authorized Judge Wills to proceed to develop the plan and carry it out." I want you to think back for a second to July of 1863. Dr. Theodore Diamond, the guy from New York whose term of service had expired, he came here to help the New York state agents in the recovery of their dead. The guy that was counting up the expenses and thinking it'd be better to have a temporary a gravesite here, a cemetery here, instead of sending them all home one by one. Diamond wrote in September of 1863, just a couple months after being here at Gettysburg. And I use his words to illustrate that perhaps in the end it's not important whose idea it was that generated the cemetery, but it was Will's that saw it through for the next 6 years. But I use Diamond's words to understand what men like Will's were thinking in this small town in July and August of 1863 on how do we best remember this moment, not only in American history, but this moment in this small Pennsylvania town that would radically change the outcome of this war and its place in American history. This is what Diamond wrote on his diary on September 7th, 1863. He said, "It is true that in war soldiers are materiel, but it is also true that the most successful armies are composed of men. And it is this country especially where we rely upon the voluntary support of the government by our people to maintain it. Rather than upon a standing army, it is important and proper that those who lose their lives in such service should not be left behind by the government to supply with their bodies mere manure for the fields where they fell." Just months after the devastation of Hurricane Helene, few of us can think about or even name the individuals responsible for finding the many affected by that tragedy, those that had lost their lives, for ensuring that their remains were identified, embalmed, and families were notified of their loss. But hopefully, by the end of this program today, you've come to understand and will remember the name of one local citizen here in Gettysburg who ensured that those that gave their last full measure of devotion would never be forgotten by a grateful nation as long as it continues to live. Thank you.